Okay, well, good evening, everybody. Hope everybody's doing well this evening. Hope you're happy as you can be under the present circumstances. As always, I want to apologize that we have to do things this way. I wish we didn't. And it's only going to be 2 more weeks after this, so we're almost done. Well, this is Psych 59080. Evolutionary psychology. And today it is entirely my baby. We're going to have a huge Mongo lecture on altruism. Altruism. Well, altruism is often a topic within social psychology, in psychology. And usually, when they're talking about altruism in social psychology, they're talking about doing a favor for somebody, picking up their mail or getting their newspaper, something of that sort. We're talking about biological altruism now, and I guess getting somebody's mail would be an example of biological altruism, but in general, here's the definition of biological altruism. Altruism occurs when I guess not biological organism, an organism incurs a reproductive cost to itself to provide a reproductive benefit to another organism. Altruism occurs when an organism incurs a reproductive cost to itself to provide a reproductive benefit to another organism. So, anytime one organism is sacrificing some of their reproductive potential, like, for example, if one organism shared food with another, or one expended energy grooming another, that would be an example of altruism. So that animal who is giving up the food is giving up those calories in that food to another animal, or grooming another animal, they're giving up the time and calories, the energy that they're expending grooming, that they could be using to gather food for themselves or find mates for themselves. So it doesn't seem to make much sense evolutionarily. Why, if the purpose of an organism is to pass along its genes and to reproduce as much as possible, why would an organism ever undergo a reproductive cost to itself for the benefit of another organism? I want to introduce a concept now that is used in populational biology, known as an evolutionarily stable strategy, ESS. I'm going to call it ESS, evolutionarily stable strategy. And that is a strategy which, if adopted by members of a population, cannot be successfully invaded by another strategy. Okay. Evolutionarily stable strategy. A strategy which, if adopted by members of a population, cannot be successfully invaded by another strategy. All right, well, what do I mean by that? Well, if we've got a group of organisms living together, and let's say these organisms, little animals, whatever they might be, they engage in indiscriminate altruism. That is, they gather some food, and then they're eating it, some of itself, maybe sharing it, and another animal comes along and asks for some food. And they say, sure, I'll just give you that food, no matter what. And then, without expecting anything in return, well, they just give up the food to any animal that asks for it, without actually expecting anything in return here. Okay, but you can see the problem here. Let's say there were this group of animals. They had this behavioral characteristic that they will always give food indiscriminately to anyone who asks for it. But let's say one day a mutation arises, and one of the animals, this mutated animal, it just takes food and doesn't give food back, or doesn't give food to anyone when asked. And so this one just takes food from the others. Well, as you can see, if the other animals are spending their time gathering food and calories, while this animal does not and just lives by asking the other animals for food, well, you can see that eventually this animal is going to pass on more of its genes than the animals that are going out and gathering the food themselves. And so what we would say is that a population of organisms, let's put this down, a population of organisms that are genuinely altruistic would not be an ESS because they could easily be invaded by cheaters. That is, if we were to actually discover a group of organisms that engaged in altruism without expecting anything in return, that would actually falsify evolutionary theory. That should not actually exist, because all it would take is an animal with a mutation that doesn't show this cooperative behavior to destroy the whole thing. And then, of course, that animal is going to pass along its genes till eventually you're just going to get a bunch of animals that try to sponge off one another, and that's not going to work very well, of course. So, essentially, a group of organisms that engage in indiscriminate altruism cannot exist under evolutionary theory. So, evolutionary theory predicts that altruistic acts should only occur if they somehow enhance the reproduction of the altruist. Okay. Evolutionary theory predicts that altruistic acts should only occur if they somehow enhance the reproduction of the altruist, I guess we should say of the altruist's genes. Let's put it that way. That's a good way of doing that. So, any act of an animal that indiscriminately gave altruism cannot exist according to evolutionary theory. If anyone asks you for a falsifier of evolutionary theory, that might be a good one to give, is, well, if we were to ever find a group of animals that engaged in indiscriminate altruism, they'll always be willing to give food or always willing to give help, no matter whether the other animal's willing to help them or not, that would in fact be a falsifier for evolutionary theory. So, why do altruistic acts occur then? And what I'm going to argue is that there are two circumstances where organisms will engage in altruism, and we're going to talk about them. Altruism among kin, and then also altruism can occur among non-kin. Let's begin by talking about altruism among kin. Okay, among kin. Well, okay, what do I mean by kin? I sound kind of like a hillbilly here. So kin are organisms that share genes. That's what kin are. And so among humans, there are some people among whom you share 100% of your genes shared. That would be yourself or an identical twin. Okay, so you share 100% of your genes with yourself. You also share, if you had an identical twin, 100% of your genes with them. There are some people who share 50% of their genes. So parents of an individual, the offspring, and the siblings, brothers and sisters. So kind of the nuclear family, mom, dad, and two kids, they all share 50% of their genes with one another. There are people who have 25% of their genes shared. That would be grandparents, and then grandchildren, also uncles and aunts, nieces, spell that right? I before E, except after C. Nieces and nephews. Okay, these would be people who share 25% of their genes. Now, let's talk about the uncles and aunts, nieces and nephews thing here. Let's say your father's sister. Your father's sister, what would she be to you? That would be your aunt, Aunt Alice. Aunt Alice married a guy named Bob, and you probably call him Uncle Bob. But is Uncle Bob your kin? The answer is no. Uncle Bob is not your kin. So that's not the type of uncle and aunt we're talking about. We're talking about ones that are actually blood relatives to you, that are actually your mom or dad's brother or sister. Okay, so that's who your kin is. All right, and then there's some people you share 12.5% of the genes shared, and that would be your first cousins. First cousins will share 12.5% of your genes with you. Okay, and so now remember, the purpose of life is to make copies of your genes. And you have some of your genes in your body, that's right, but you can see you share some genes. These genes are in other people's bodies as well. And the idea is, well, you could copy your genes by reproducing yourself, but also you could make copies of your genes by helping these other people that share your genes to reproduce. And this is the concept of, let's move it down to here, I think. This is the concept of inclusive fitness. Inclusive fitness. This is the sum of an individual's own reproductive success plus the effects the individual has on the reproductive success of his/her genetic relatives. Inclusive fitness, the sum of an individual's own reproductive success plus the effects the individual has on the reproductive success of his or her genetic relatives. So, another way to pass along your genes is to help people who share genes with you. That was kind of Diamond's theory of homosexuality, if you recall. His idea was that maybe if you had a homosexual family member, it could provide an extra adult caregiver for children when times got bad or in times of famine. That's the idea, is that the aunt or uncle is passing along their genes through the niece and nephew rather than reproducing themselves. Now, there is a theory of inclusive fitness, and this is known as Hamilton's rule. Hamilton's rule really upended the entire field of population biology when he first published it in 1964. So this is probably one of the most important things you can know, is Hamilton's rule of inclusive fitness. And we'll talk about why it's so important a little bit later. Hamilton's rule of inclusive fitness, and I'll put the year down, 1964, which says natural selection favors altruism when C less than R times B. C less than R times B, where C is the reproductive cost to the giver of the altruism. So C is cost to the giver. R is the degree of genetic relatedness between giver and recipient, by which I mean the proportion of shared genes, which would be, for example, e.g. 0.5 for siblings, 0.125 for first cousins. Okay, R is the degree of genetic relationship between giver and recipient, and then B is the reproductive cost to the is reproductive benefit to the recipient. Okay, B is the reproductive benefit to the recipient. So Hamilton's rule of inclusive fitness, 1964, natural selection favors altruism whenever C less than R times B, where C is the reproductive cost to the giver, essentially the number of genes that they aren't going to copy as a result of giving this up. R is the degree of genetic relatedness, that's the proportion of shared genes. And then B is the reproductive benefit to the recipient, essentially the number of extra genes they're going to copy as a result of this. Okay, so what does this mean? Well, this means in some cases it's actually in your genetic best interests, as far as copying your genes, to sacrifice yourself for the benefit of, say, a family member, one of your kin, somebody you're related to. So, for example, let's say that you were passing a river and you find your brother is like drowning in the river. Now, you could save him. You could jump in the water and save him, but you would die in the process. So you're going to die as a result of this. And the question is, should you save him? Okay. Well, I don't know. We can set his life or whatever. We'll set that to benefit to one. The cost to one, you're losing you. Benefit to him is the same. He keeps his life. So we'll make C and B are going to be the same there, whatever we might want to set them to. But then the R, the degree of genetic relationship, is 0.5 between you. So there, because this is 0.5, well, this part of the equation is going to be lower than the cost. You're going to die, and so you're actually going to pass on fewer genes if you jump in and save him, so you shouldn't save him. On the other hand, let's say your brother, your mother, and your daughter, brother, mother, and daughter, all related 0.5 to you. Well, let's say they were drowning in the river, and you could save all three of them by jumping in, but you would die yourself. Well, there, now R is 0.5 plus 0.5 plus 0.5, 1.5, and then the benefit is going to be 1 to them, let's say, and your cost is going to be 1 life dead. And so there, well, this side of the equation would be larger than this side of the equation to save 3 genetic relatives related 0.5 to you. So evolutionary theory suggests that, yes, under those circumstances, you ought to jump in the river and save them. Now, if there was just your brother and your sister that you could save, well, then C would be equal to R times B. That is, as many of your genes are in the river as are in you. And so it could go either way. You might go in the river, you might not. You'd be kind of indifferent. It does look kind of cold, so I don't know if you should get in there or not. Now, how many first cousins should be willing to save? Well, R is 0.125 for them. So, yes, you should be willing to jump in the river to save 9 first cousins, but not 7 first cousins. You're better off not jumping in the river then. So that is the idea, is that you can actually maybe pass on more of your genes by sacrificing yourself than actually trying to reproduce yourself. Now, having said this, how does this, would something like this evolve? Is there really a lot of instances where we would encounter people that were drowning in rivers, near relatives that we could save at the cost to ourselves? Well, probably not, that's right. And then what about this C and B thing? Could we actually measure these things? Well, no. Okay, these are theoretical concepts. We can't really measure, the C, the cost to the giver, and B, the benefits to the recipient. But as theoretical constructs, we could put them in a computer where we actually, simulate a situation where we know the values of C and B. And then what you find is that the animals that pass along the most genes are the ones that behave according to Hamilton's rule. So the closer an animal's behavior comes to behaving like Hamilton's rule, the more genes they pass on. So we'd expect over time psychological mechanisms to develop to get organisms to behave in the way Hamilton's rule requires. And so how did Hamilton's rule actually evolve? Well, let's imagine a situation with two chipmunks, okay, Alvin and Theodore, let's call them, and they're sitting and eating. They're about 6 feet away from one another. And while they're sitting, Alvin and Theodore eating, a huge grizzly bear comes out and starts attacking Theodore. Now, Alvin's about 6 feet away from this thing, and so my question for you is, when Alvin sees this huge grizzly bear come and attack Theodore, what emotion is Alvin going to feel? And I would guess he's going to feel fear in that situation. He's going to be afraid of the grizzly bear. And what is Alvin going to do? He's going to run. He's going to run away. He's not going to try and help Theodore. Okay. Now, Theodore was his kin. He was related 0.5. They're brothers, let's say. And so the reason, let's apply our rule here. So there's R is 0.5. But what is B in this situation? How much benefit can Alvin give to Theodore? Well, Alvin is not going to be very useful against a grizzly bear, so pretty much B is 0. So we're taking 0.5 times 0 there. So you got 0 on this side of the equation. So pretty much no cost is worth helping Theodore in that situation because you can't benefit him. And so the best thing to do in that situation is not offer altruism. This side of the equation is lower than this side of the equation. You should just run away. Okay, so that's one scenario. All right, second scenario. Alvin and Theodore are 6 feet away feeding their brothers. And now a kind of scrawny little chipmunk, not very strong, comes and sneaks up on Theodore, jumps on his back, and starts biting at him kind of ferociously. So what is going to be Alvin's reaction, or what's emotion is he going to feel when he sees his brother Theodore being attacked by this scrawny little chipmunk? Well, he'll probably be angry about that, I would guess. And now he'll probably go and try and help Theodore, and together they could probably beat up this little chipmunk. So in this case, there is going to be a substantial benefit. It's a little bit of a cost. Probably the two of you together wouldn't have much trouble beating up the scrawny little chipmunk, but there is a potential you could get injured, of course. So there is going to be a little bit of a cost here to reproductive potential. But the benefit is great if you actually save your brother's life, because you probably wouldn't get killed in the process. And so R times B in that circumstance is going to be greater than C. And so that's why the chipmunk would offer altruism, or should offer altruism ideally in that case. So see, I think that is where Hamilton's rule comes from, is where does the switch occur between being afraid of a situation and not offering any help, getting out of the situation, and being angry about the situation, and then offering help as because of that. Well, as the closer an animal's behavior comes to approximating this, the more genes they're going to pass on. So the idea is, over time, animals have mechanisms for assessing the degree of genetic relationship they have with other animals, and making some kind of assessment of the benefit they can offer in a situation and the costs. An animal that would rush in even when it couldn't provide any benefit, well, it's not going to pass on very many of its genes. And then an animal that never gives help, even though it could actually be of help to its brother, well, it's not going to pass along many of its genes. It's the animals that can make, whose fear to anger switch is approximating, we're going to give help when the costs are less than R times B, and we're not going to give help when the costs are greater than R times B. An animal whose switch from anger to fear works on that basis is going to pass along the most genes. So that's the idea. That's how this evolved over time. Hamilton's rule evolved. Okay. Now, there's lots of examples in the real world of animals, non-human animals, sacrificing themselves kind of in consonance, I guess you'd say, with Hamilton's rule. Let's take Belding's ground squirrels. They have an alarm squeal that they will give out when they see a predator. And so the alarm squeal will tell other animals that this predator is in the area, the other ground squirrels, so that they can hide. But do you see any cost into giving this squeak to warn the other ground squirrels? Well, yeah, the obvious cost is that's going to draw attention to you, and so probably of all the squirrels that are that might have gotten eaten by the all the ground squirrels that might have gotten eaten, you're the most likely to get eaten, and that's right. The one who gives the call is 40% more likely to get eaten than any of the other ground squirrels. So this is an act of altruism. Now, here's the thing about these Belding's ground squirrels. They are matrilineal, meaning that they live in groups, but what happens is when the males reach maturity, they leave their social group and go to another different social group. And so the females, on the other hand, stay with the same social group their whole lives. Now, the question is, when a squirrel gives this call, is it more likely to be a female squirrel or a male squirrel that gives the call? And the answer is, yeah, it's a female squirrel that gives the calls in these situations. The reason is that she has a ton of kin within the group. She probably has aunts, uncles, maybe parents, grandparents, who I don't know how long they live, and then offspring, nieces, nephews. She's probably got lots and lots and lots of relatives she's saving by giving the call. But for the male Belding's ground squirrel, well, the male squirrel, his offspring he shares genes with, but really doesn't share genes with any of the other members of the group. And so it makes a lot of sense that, yeah, a female would be willing to give the call because she can probably copy more of her genes by doing that, and that the males would not. Black widow spider. Why is it called the black widow spider? Well, it's called the black widow spider because after the male and female black widow mate, the female eats the male spider. That's right. Why is it called black? Well, because it's black. That's why. Okay, so that's why it's called the black widow spider. Now, I was horrified when I found this out as a child. I thought, well, this is awful. Why would anybody get eaten like that? And so when I was a child, I didn't like this. I thought, well, can't they warn the squirrels, the spider somehow that he's going to get eaten? Can we get him out of there? And so I really didn't like that. And then when I was a teenager, this seemed strange to me. I learned about evolution. It would seem like, why would the male be eaten? It would seem like it's in the male's best interest to go out and try and reproduce again. And so in my mind, what I decided is, well, what must happen is that after mating, the male tries to get away and may be successful sometimes. The female tries to eat him. So sometimes the female eats him, and sometimes the male gets away to reproduce again. And that's how I reconciled evolutionary theory with that behavior in my mind. No, that's totally wrong. The male does not try to get away from the female after mating. In fact, the male runs around and crawls right into the female's mouth so that he can be eaten. So what's up with that? That seems crazy. He's destroying any potential that he is ever going to actually reproduce himself. Oh, good.